There were no adventures in his life. Oshiro was born in an ordinary family and spent his days without problems and fuss, and his life was characterized by only a simple, ordinary, and boring everyday life in which nothing special happened. He thought that his life was doomed, but everything was different there. Oshiro, with a surprised expression on his face, his eyes wide open, looked at the monitor screen that was on the table in front of him. On this screen was a game character. Oshiro thought that everything changed as soon as he came across the fate of the hero, because there he became a master of the game. When the sun set over high-rise residential buildings, Oshiro loosened the tie on his neck and stretched his hand to the table, thinking that he could finally be alone. After that, he began to think about how much he hated school. He pressed the power button on his computer, thinking that there was nothing wrong with his love for single-player games. He sat down in front of his monitor screen and, with a smile on his face, massaging his hands, he thought that here he was the king. After that, he began to talk about how when he plays a single-player game, you can always save and restart it to start all over again. And if you use cheats, you can overcome all sorts of limitations and become the strongest. Oshiro understood that with this approach, the world exists only for one player. Oshiro, with an interested expression on his face, looking at the monitor screen with gaming headphones on his ears, reacted in surprise to what was happening on the monitor, after which he grinned and suggested that he try again. The screen said that the game character was being revived. In the chat that was visible on the monitor screen, one of the users wrote that the broadcast time was on a weekday, and this means that Oshiro is a middle or high school student, after which the user asked, "Does this student sit down to stream right after school?" Another user answered this question, suggesting that it is possible. That is true, but he does not think that you can make a living from streaming. After that, another user noted that this is a turn-based strategy, so it's boring to watch it live. But this user noted that Oshiro is doing well. After that, this user asked him if he plans to do this professionally in the future. The second user noted that he agrees with this statement because Oshiro is quite smart. Oshiro looked at the monitor screen with a smile on his face, noticing that these guys do not know how to praise at all. Suddenly, a notification appeared on the monitor screen that one of the users who had just written a message in the chat sent him $10. Oshiro reacted in surprise to this, noticing how generous it was. He planned to send words of gratitude to this user. Suddenly, another notification appeared that one of the users sent him $1,000. Oshiro, with a shocked expression on his face, froze in place from extreme surprise, looked at the monitor screen, after which he began to squeeze the monitor with his hands, frightenedly cursing and asking again, "How much?" He was shaking in surprise, opening his eyes and mouth wide. One of the users noticed that he was sent $1,000 and he didn't even tell him anything? Then this user noted that there are basics that streamers follow to show their best side. Another user noted that soon this user will start crying and beg him to return the money. After that, the user who recently sent $1,000 to Oshiro asked him to read the letter he sent him. Oshiro looked at the monitor screen in surprise and asked again, "A letter?" He saw that on the desktop of his computer next to the image of the letter there was a number 1, which notified Oshiro that he had received a new notification. Oshiro clicked on this letter with the cursor of his computer mouse, after which a message opened for him saying that the game master informs him that he is a viewer who likes watching his channel and he is also an indie game developer. Oshiro asked himself in surprise, a game developer? The game master continued to tell him that there was one game that he had spent a lot of time creating and perhaps this game was too difficult, but no one had passed the beta test. Oshiro chuckled with interest as he read these messages. The game master continued to write that he would be grateful if he left a review after completing it so that they could adjust the difficulty level. Then he noted that he asked to refrain from publishing, distributing, etc. Oshiro looked at the monitor screen and said, "This DA." He reread the message in which DA wrote that perhaps this game was too difficult, but no one had passed the beta test. Oshiro thought that this was a game that no one had been able to pass the beta test. He opened his mouth looking at the monitor screen. There was a question written there addressed to him. Does he want to try it? Oshiro, with a confident smile on his face looking ahead, thought that even an ordinary person like him could become special, after which he confidently shouted, "Yes." Then he clicked the cursor of his computer mouse on the affirmative answer, wanting to install the game. He pressed the button on the computer mouse, shouting loudly that he would do it. Then he swore harshly, repeating, "Of course yes." Soon after, a notification appeared on the monitor screen that the installation of the hero's fate was complete. Oshiro was offered to start the game. Then the system window said that in the game, the year 294 according to the imperial calendar, the kingdom of Jaipur invaded the neighboring kingdom of Rock, turning it into a solid sea without fire, and this marked the beginning of a turbulent era. Oshiro was told that he was born with a small and insignificant soul and his task was that he needed to survive the turbulent times and become a hero, then bring down his hammer of justice on the evil god and ascend to the throne. The system window told Oshiro that if he did this, he would be able to make any wish. Oshiro thought that this was the reason why the name of the game is The Fate of the Hero, and then he noticed that the graphic part in this game does not stand out with anything remarkable. After that, he remembered that the creator told him that he created this game himself. So he noticed that under such conditions, in principle, it was not bad. The system window asked Oshiro to enter the name of his character. Oshiro thoughtfully looked at this request, saying the name. He decided that ultimately it was not so important. Then pressing the buttons on the keyboard, he wrote that his name was the Game Master. The system window greeted the Game Master on the continent of Erin. Oshiro found himself surrounded by a picturesque landscape, which consisted of many mountains, as well as the sea and forests. Oshiro himself was surrounded by trees. He reacted with surprise at what surrounded him. Then Oshiro looked at the screen and asked, "And what is this?" He wondered if there was any training here. Then he noticed that in general everything was clear, so he did not think that he would need this training. And then he looked in front of him and saw a man standing in front of him. It was the village chief. The village chief, with a tired expression on his face, noticed that he was seeing him for the first time. Then he asked him why he came to this village. Oshiro pressed his lips together and asked himself, what was that? Then he asked if there were any answer options. He noticed that he was given the opportunity to write the answer himself in the blank line after his name. Oshiro cursed in confusion and asked again if he needed to write it himself. He reacted to this in surprise, saying that he couldn't believe it. Then he pressed his keyboard and began addressing the village chief, ordering him to give him all the gold coins or he would kill all the villagers. The village chief listened to him, holding a wooden object behind his back. Oshiro looked at his computer screen warily. The village chief, with a sharp movement of his hand, clutching a wooden stick in his hand, hit Oshiro on the head, asking him, "Who does he think he is?" After that, the village chief called him a minor. Oshiro made a painful sound from a powerful blow to the head. Oshiro asked himself in bewilderment, "What?" The monitor screen showed that his eyelids were getting heavy. Oshiro fell lifelessly to the ground. The system window notified Oshiro that he had died and the cause of his death was a blunt wound. Oshiro was lying in a pool of blood in the middle of the road. Oshiro screamed loudly. In front of him on the screen, the system window asked him if he wanted to try again. Oshiro, with beads of sweat running down his face, said in surprise, "Wow." After that he asked himself, did he die from a normal conversation with an NPC? He looked at the choice that the system window gave him. He cursed at the system window with an irritated expression and then shouted, "Yes." Oshiro thought that this was starting to annoy him. Then he cursed again at the game he was playing. After that, when he met the village chief again, the village chief noticed that it was the first time he saw him. Then the village chief asked him why he came to this village. Oshiro crossed his fingers in front of his chest and with a pleading expression told the village chief that he was lost and that he had not eaten or drunk for a long time. He asked the village chief to show a little compassion for the poor man. The village chief turned around and, leaning on the wooden stick he was holding in his hands, chuckled and asked Oshiro to just follow him. Oshiro, with a surprised expression on his face and with beads of sweat running down his face, looked after the village chief. After some time, they entered the room. Oshiro was silent and looked at the village elder. The elder handed him a glass and asked him to drink it and leave peacefully. Oshiro took the glass in his hand and thanked the elder for it. Then he leaned his hand on his side and began to write a drink from the glass. Soon after that his look changed. He, with a painful expression on his face, Oshiro began to fall down. A notification appeared that he was poisoned with a poisonous drink. After that, the system window informed him that he died because he was poisoned and the cause of his death was a deadly poison. Oshiro sat on a chair without showing any signs of life. Oshiro irritably shouted sarcastically that this was wonderful. Then he noted with malice in his voice that in the end he died again. Then Oshiro looked at the system unit of his computer with a sly smile on his face, and he asked himself, what if? After that, he took one of the wires that was connected to his system unit and, taking it out of the connector, mentally asked himself, how about this? Then he shouted with a triumphant expression on his face that if there is no internet connection, the NPC will not be able to do anything. He understood that now he will definitely have to suffer. Sometime after that, Oshiro approached the elder of the village with a lot of interference on the screen. The elder, addressing Oshiro, said that he sees him for the first time. Then he asked him why he came to this village. Oshiro answered him incomprehensibly due to problems with the internet. Soon after, a message appeared on the screen saying that he died because Oshiro said ridiculous things for which his tongue was cut off and the cause of his death was severe bleeding. Then a question appeared on the screen asking if he wanted to try again. Oshiro threw the computer mouse into his desk in rage. He looked in front of him in bewilderment and asked. He couldn't handle it even with the internet turned off. He began to reason that the person who sent him the letter was the creator of the game. He looked at the name of this user and asked himself again, DA? After that, he came to the conclusion that people on the network have no idea who he is. Oshiro, with a thoughtful expression on his face looking in front of him, putting his hand to his chin, asked himself, and yet what is the name of the development team? Then Oshiro turned his attention to the electronic clock. On this electronic clock it was written that at that moment it was 1 in the morning and 38 minutes. Oshiro cursed, realizing that it was already past midnight. He decided that he had enough for today and saved the game by clicking on the appropriate option. Oshiro reasoned that he had never thought that he would have to talk to an NPC. He thought that it was the same as if he was told that the world of the hero's fate really exists. But he told himself that he would never believe it. Oshiro was lying on the bed that was very close to his computer chair and equipment. He was lying on this bed with his hand on his face. Oshiro thought that this is why no one made it to the end during the beta test. Oshiro closed his eyes and was already getting ready for bed. Suddenly his eyes opened wide. He thought that this excites him very much. From that moment on, he put his whole soul into becoming special. He did not realize how much time he would spend on this. Oshiro constantly clicked his computer mouse to load and save. Sitting in headphones, he immersed himself in the game again and again. 10 years later, Oshiro was sitting at his desk in an office building when an attractive girl named Suzuhara approached him and told him that she had sent him an edited document. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for it. When the evening came, this Suzuhara asked him if he had finished yet. After that, she noticed that they had worked hard. Oshiro turned to her and thanked her for her hard work. Suzuhara pursed her lips and looked ahead uncertainly. She looked up at him with an embarrassed expression and offered him dinner at her house. Then she asked him if he would agree to it. Oshiro looked at her with a stern expression while holding a briefcase in his hand. Suzuhara had a pitiful look. She waited for his answer with trepidation. Oshiro asked her again and then apologized and told her that he could not. He told her that he needed to go home. With a smile on her face, Suzuhara asked him again and Oshiro explained to her that today was too important a day. He waved his hand at her and apologized to her again, offering to arrange it another time. Suzuhara, with a confused expression on her face, sitting on the chair, agreed with him, and then looking after him, she said that he refused her again. When the working day was over and Oshiro returned to his home in a tall modern residential building, he, just like 10 years ago, loosened the tie around his neck with a confident expression on his face, looked ahead and said to himself that today he would complete the fate of a hero. He took the computer mouse in his hand. Some time later, when the morning came, Oshiro exhaled air from his lungs. On the screen of his monitor there was a congratulation addressed to him. Inside this message was written that he was the first person to enter the Hall of Fame. Oshiro, looking at this, said that this is the end. He carefully looked ahead at the screen of his monitor. Oshiro, with a happy expression on his face, shouted that he finally beat this game. When he shouted about this, he clenched his palm into a fist and raised it up. After that, the smile on his face began to weaken. Soon he sat with a sad expression on his face. He thought about the fact that 10 years had passed. After that, his hands dropped down. He realized that while he was playing, he really wanted to become special. But his life was still mediocre. Oshiro silently looked at the glowing monitor that was in front of him. With a smile on his face, he said that he was devastated. Oshiro thought that he seemed to have a second life. Then he began to remember the Black Prince Gale Krakow, Cardinal Cesare Ravallo, the witch Celestine Yulin. He thought that they were incredibly charming and unique characters and their reactions were so lively that it was impossible to distinguish them from real people. He remembered how happy he was surrounded by these characters and sometimes he wondered if there were such people in his world. He took off his glasses from his eyes and began to squeeze his eyes with his palms, saying that this is really the end. Suddenly, his computer made a notification sound. Oshiro looked at it in surprise and asked, "What?" A system window appeared on his computer screen and asked him if he wanted to go on a new adventure. Under this question was an explanation that if he chose the answer yes, he would be transported to the continent of Erin. After that, a note was written that after his consent, he would not be able to return back until he completed his journey. The system window asked him to think about his choice carefully. Oshiro asked himself in confusion, "What is this?" He asked with a tense expression, frowning his eyebrows, "A hidden scenario?" Then he asked again, "A continuation?" He took the computer mouse in his hand thinking that if he could again feel that thrill and excitement. Immediately after that Oshiro shouted with excitement in his eyes that he could not disagree. When he made his choice, the space around him began to distort. A notification explained that he was being transported to the continent of Erin. Soon after, a greeting appeared in front of him that called him an apostle. Oshiro exhaled heavily from his lungs and asked in confusion, "What kind of nonsense is this?" He noticed in surprise that his chest was burning very badly, and it was difficult for him to breathe. Then he painfully exhaled the air from his lungs and looking around in bewilderment asked, "Where is he?" He understood that a second ago he was in the room. Suddenly, someone turned to him and noticed that he finally woke up. The person who addressed him noticed that he was incredibly happy. It was an adult man named Russell. Russell noted that if they did not have such a valuable potion at their disposal, he would not have been able to meet the dawn. Oshiro in a new guise with wide open eyes looked ahead in fear. Oshiro with a painful expression on his face looked ahead in surprise while lying on the bed. Russell addressed him and called him Mr. Calyx. The protagonist asked him who he was. Russell frowned his eyebrows with a serious expression on his face and chuckled. At this time he was thinking about the fact that the doctor did not warn him about the possibility of memory loss. The protagonist, in a state of shock, asked himself, "Who is this and where is he?" Russell asked him if he really does not remember him. Then Russell, pressing his hand to his chest, bowed to him, telling him that his name was Russell. Calyx asked him again, "Russell?" At this time, he was asking himself, and how should he understand this? He understood that they were definitely not in Japan, and he was not speaking Japanese. The protagonist, with beads of sweat flowing down his face and a pale face, was clutching the blanket that was lying on him. The protagonist understood that although he understood his speech, he also thought that his chest hurt so much as if he was burning. The protagonist began to writhe in pain, squeezing his entire body. He was shaking, clenching his jaw. Russell approached him and stretched out his hand towards him, shouting, "Prince." Then Russell, pressing his hands to his hips, asked him for forgiveness and explained that it was all because of his haste. After that, Russell asked Calyx not to worry. He explained to him that the pain was just a side effect of the potion. The main character continued to shrink while lying on the bed. He exhaled heavily from his lungs. Russell explained to him that everything would soon pass. After that, Russell, pressing his hand to his chest, suggested that it would take longer to recover. He asked Calyx to forgive him, and then told him that he would visit him soon. He went out the door and once again asked him for forgiveness. The main character was left lying alone in the room. In this room there was a lot of different furniture made of wood, and the room was lit only by the light of one candle. Calyx was lying on the bed with the same pale expression on his face, heavily exhaling air from his lungs. Nothing changed for a long time. After a while the candle burned halfway, and then all that was left was melted smoking wax. Waking up, the main character got to his feet, noticing that it was a good dream. He walked with his thin legs towards the mirror that was on the opposite side of the room. When he approached the mirror and looked at his reflection, he realized that he was not imagining things. Looking at the person he saw in the mirror, he thought about how he felt like he was not in his body. Then he looked at his reflection in fear and asked, "What is his name?" Squeezing the hair on his head and moving hysterically, he asked why he only remembers 30 years of his life. He moved, actively screaming that at the same time he cannot remember his usual name at the moment. He looked closely at his reflection and asked, "Who is he?" He touched the reflection of his hand on the mirror with his hand. After that he shouted that he. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of Calyx. He looked at it in fear with wide open eyes. The main character shouted in surprise that this is a system window. Information about the character's personality was written on the system window. His name was Calyx Shaken. He was a 15-year-old boy of noble status. He belonged to the Shaken County. He had no profession, just as he had no predisposition. His status was the stage of recovery from an injury. The injury from which she was recovering was a stab wound in the chest area. Calyx's combat power was first class, that is, the 8th level out of 37. His fame was 3 out of 7 and his reputation was 14%. His skills were administration, as well as finance and military affairs. In addition, he was capable of diplomacy and development. The protagonist opened his mouth in surprise and stretched out his hand in front of him and asked himself, "Is this the fate of a hero?" He said with a frightened expression that he could not even think that he would actually be transferred to the continent of Erin. In Calyx's memories, a system window appeared that asked him if he wanted to undertake a new adventure. Under this inscription was a signature that if he chose yes, he would be brought to the continent of Erin, and after his consent he would not be able to return back until he completed his journey. The system window also asked him to think everything over carefully. Calyx, straining his body looking irritably into his memories, asked, did he just want to stick it in the game? Looking around, the main character said that this place is the main stage in the hero's fate, that is, the continent of Erin. Calyx tried to catch his breath while beads of sweat were running down his face. He raised his hand to his chest, realizing that he needed to calm down. After that, he looked in front of him with a tense gaze at the mirror opposite him. He pressed his hand to his chest and painfully exhaled air from his lungs. He suddenly fell to his knees and began to shake in pain, making painful sounds. He cursed, noticing that the pain was hellish, but he did not wake up. He realized that based on this it turns out that this is not a dream but reality. He lay on the floor looking in front of him. He said that this means that he will have to get used to the strange name of this man. Then he said that his name is Calyx Shaken. He crawled to his bed and put his face and hands on it. He paid attention to the system window. Looking at it with a surprised expression on his face, he noticed that it turns out that if he only wants to see his status, this window immediately appears. Then he opened his mouth in surprise and shouted that only he can see this thing. With a smile on his face and his eyes shining with positive emotions, he shouted that this is great. His cheeks turned red. The main character, looking at the system window with excitement, suggested that they first start collecting information. With a smirk on his face, raising his eyebrows up, Calyx decided that if he is careless in this world, he will immediately die. He paid attention to the information in the system window where it was written that he belongs to the county of Shaken. Looking at this, he noticed that the name Calyx is borne by the son of the county of Shaken. He understood that in this case it is logical that his last name coincides with the name of this territory. He realized that this means that he is a direct descendant of the great Count's family. The protagonist, with a thoughtful expression on his face, looking at the system windows, said that he was lucky, of course, but he still needed to read. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door that led to the room he was in. Calix, looking in fear in the direction where the sound came from, mentally asked himself, who was there? He began to hastily ask himself, how should he behave? Then he abruptly asked himself, what should he do? With a frightened and tense expression on his face, he realized that first he needed to calm down, and that it would be the end for him if someone found out that he had moved into this body. Widely opening his eyes, Calix stared in front of him, realizing that he was a high-ranking aristocrat and a direct descendant of the Calix Shaken Count's family. Then, in incredible tension, he continued to repeat that he was Calix Shaken. Then he asked, who was there? Behind the door stood a girl who was holding something in her hands. She addressed the protagonist as a prince, and told him that it was time to take his medicine. She was holding a wooden tray in her hands, on which was a deep plate. Calix, looking at the door, asked himself again, a maid? Then he realized that he needed to get used to the new treatment. Looking at the door, sitting on the bed, he ordered her to come in. A girl named Lyra entered the room and asked him for forgiveness. The protagonist looked at her in surprise. Lyra knelt in front of him and, pulling out a tray in front of her, asked him to take the medicine. Then she looked carefully into his eyes from the bottom up and asked him again to take it before it cooled down. Calix, confused, looking at her, said that she. Then he realized his mistake, mentally cursed, calling himself a fool. He sharply asked himself, what is he doing? He realized that this was the same as saying that he is not Calix. Lyra, with a surprised expression on her face, looking at him, asked him, did something happen? The protagonist sharply answered her that nothing happened. He understood that it was more correct that there was nothing wrong with just trying. A system window appeared in front of his eyes, describing Lyra. Her age was indicated, that is, 23 years old, as well as her name. She was a commoner who belonged to the outskirts of Viscount Kosherin. Her profession was a maid, and her predisposition was a cold-blooded egoist. Her status was normal, and her combat power was 3rd class and level 33 out of 51 available. Glory was equal to 1 out of 7. Her reputation was negative, that is, -3, and her skills were administration, finance, diplomacy and development of level F, and military affairs of level E. The protagonist, looking closely at the system window, thought that her name was Lyra. Then he noticed that her affiliation was the outskirts of Viscount Kosherin. He looked at this in surprise and asked himself again, doesn't this mean that she serves Kosherin and not his family? Looking at the system window that was near her face, he reasoned that it seemed like the 3rd class meant that she could not use mana, but by the standards of his world, her training corresponded to the level of special forces. He understood that they were the best of the best, and after that he asked himself, so why was she just a maid? Lyra at that moment looked closely into his eyes, motionless, continuing to stand on her knee with a tray stretched out in front of her. Calix, looking at her, reasoned that he came from a family of shaken wounded, but he was served by a maid from another family. He understood that if a maid of another family brought medicine, then this thing should definitely not be drunk. He pressed his lips together, looking intently at the vessel that Lyra held in her hands. Lyra asked him fearfully, Prince? Then she again stretched out the tray in front of her, once again asking him to drink it. Calix exhaled air from his lungs and asked her to put the medicine on the table. Lyra came even closer to him with a wide smile on her face, insistently telling him to drink it quickly. The main character, with a tense and reddened from irritation expression on his face with veins bulging on his face, took this deep plate in his hand and looked menacingly in front of himself, mentally cursing at Lyra. He thought that he would never drink this thing. When he brought this thing to his face, he suddenly began to cough and cringe in pain, at the same time throwing this plate aside, while shouting about how everything hurt. Lyra looked closely at the plate that was flying away from him. Calix looked at her from under his brows and mentally asked her, how is this a move for her? Lyra continued to watch the plate flying away from them, and then with an incredibly fast, sharp and precise movement of her body, she put her hand under this plate. The protagonist looked at her in genuine bewilderment. Leaning on the floor, Lyra managed to grab the plate in a split second and do it so that the contents of it did not spill. After that, Lyra looked ahead with a cold gaze from under her brows. Calix looked at her with fear and asked himself, what kind of nonsense is this? Lyra grabbed a deep plate with an elixir in her hand and raised it up. The protagonist noticed in surprise that she was incredibly fast. Lyra got to her feet and looked closely at the potion that she was holding in her hands. Calix looked at her with a tense expression on his face and thought that his plans were shattered because of her skills. Then Lyra turned away from him and began to put the potion on the tray. Calix at this time made painful sounds, straining his entire body. Lyra noticed that it was good that she managed to save the medicine. Calix didn't want to think about the bad, he lowered his face to his hands and began to heavily exhale air from his lungs. Lyra looked at him in bewilderment with a questioning look. The main character understood that he could really die here. He realized that this was definitely poison, and he would never drink it. He began to fall to the floor from his bed. Lyra noticed this and looked in his direction with a worried look. When Calix was falling, he thought about how he needed to somehow distract her from this cup. However, he did not have time to fall, since Lyra, with the same swift movement, managed to catch him before he fell to the floor. Then, putting him on the bed, she asked him if he was okay. The main character answered her negatively. At this time, he asked himself in bewilderment, what should he do with her? He understood that she approached him too quickly. Then he carefully looked in front of him at the system window on which Lyra's characteristics were written. Looking at this, Calix frowned and asked what kind of Viscounty kosherin was that Lyra served. He began to talk about how he was the son of the first wife of the count who had already died. At that time, Lyra sat him down on the bed, holding him with her hands. Calix asked himself while thinking, does he have a half-brother from his second wife? Then he decided that of course he did, and besides, he was older than him. He was 16 years old. Then he asked himself again, is the maiden name of the count's second wife kosherin? He realized that in other words, Lyra served the second wife, which meant that his stepmother had deliberately sent this servant to him. Moreover, Calix understood that she was perfectly trained to kill. He thought that if he died, his stepmother's son would become the next count, and this meant that, as usually happens, this story is about the struggle of two brothers for the throne. The face of the main character acquired a happy expression. He thought with a smile on his face and shining eyes that this was cool, and this is exactly what he expected to see in the fate of the hero. He was glad that it would be insanely difficult. After that, Calix, turning to Lyra, told her that he was already fine. Then he thanked her and with a smile on his face asked her how his stepmother was doing. When he asked this question, he looked intently at Lyra. Lyra was briefly confused and looked at him in surprise. Then she pulled herself together and told him that the countess was very saddened by the prince's attempt to commit suicide. And then Lyra said that she asked him to tell him never to do that again. Calix looked ahead with a thoughtful expression on his face. He asked himself if the owner of this body really had such thoughts. He noticed the wound in the center of his chest and thought that judging by the wound and the status window, it looked more like they wanted to stab him with a knife. Then he turned to Lyra and agreed with her and said that he promised not to bother her anymore. Lyra looked away and noted that she thought the countess would be very happy to hear his answer. Lyra answered him by saying that she could tell her these words right now. Lyra looked at him intently with her cold gaze from under her brows and noted that she was sorry, but he had not yet taken the medicine. The protagonist made a frightened sound and looked at her with wide open eyes. He strained his whole body, mentally tried to stop her, and then asked himself, will she leave until he takes the medicine? Lyra at that moment turned around and went to get the medicine from the table which was located a few meters from Calix. The protagonist at that time understood that the situation was developing negatively. He tried to think faster about the fact that he could not politely ask her to leave because she was a murderer. He cursed in the direction of Lyra and then began to think about the fact that he was a 30-year-old man in the fragile body of a teenage boy with a frail soul. Beads of sweat were running down Calix's face and body. He looked at Lyra with a tense jaw and a frightened look. Looking at her back, he began to assume, maybe it would be better for him to just loudly make love? Then he decided that he probably shouldn't do that because she could cut his throat when he started screaming. He realized that in this case he would die even faster. He pursed his lips and with a worried expression came to the conclusion that apparently he had no other choice but to drink this poison. At that moment, Lyra began to approach him holding the medicine in her hands. The main character with a concentrated look looking ahead stopped his stream of thoughts, noticing that he did not understand one thing. Then he looked at the medicine and asked himself, why poison? Then he assumed, wouldn't it have been easier to just use his knife? Looking at how Lyra brought the medicine to him with a smile on her face, he thought that now he understood. He realized that she did not want to attract unnecessary attention. Calix reasoned that if he was right, then this was a poison that was difficult to notice, and this meant that his death could be passed off as suicide. He knew the name of this poison. It was a slow death poison. Lyra, with a slight smile on her face, told him that if it was difficult for him to swallow, then she would help him with it. Calix clenched his fists and remembered that he realized this when he played the hero's fate. He understood that there was only one truth in the game. With wide open eyes, looking ahead, Calix remembered that this truth is that you must always assume the worst-case scenario, because it can become real, and if he wants to live, he must doubt everything and always be prepared for the worst. Lowering his head, Calix understood that if he refused, then most likely she would force him to drink it. He grinned with flushed cheeks, looking ahead and thought about what was exciting him. He thought about how the hero's fate had driven him into a corner again. Lyra knelt in front of the main hero and held out the medicine in his direction, then she turned to him questioningly. He, holding onto the bed with his hands, told her that everything was fine. Then he took the medicine, that is, the poison, and began to drink it. He drank the potion, moving his Adam's apple while consuming the poison, and Lyra watched intently as he swallowed the poison. The system window showed a notification that he had been poisoned with a slow death poison. The protagonist thought that this was exactly what he had expected, then he asked himself how he could not die. He repeatedly ordered himself to think. Lyra at this time got up to take the dishes to the table, and Calix with a painful expression on his face understood that he needed anything that could help him. Then turning to himself, he again expressively ordered to think. Memories of Russell telling him that if they did not have such a valuable potion at their disposal, he might not see the dawn. Then memories of Russell introducing himself to him with his hand pressed to his chest appeared in his mind. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise with wide open eyes, then he turned to Lyra and asked her if she could call Russell. Lyra asked him why he needed him. The protagonist looked at her with an irritated expression and asked her sternly, "Does he need to report to the maid?" He frowned and looked at her angrily. Lyra apologized to him in confusion and said that it was stupid of her to ask such a thing. Calix began to shout that if she understood everything perfectly well, then she should fulfill his order as soon as possible. The protagonist understood that the top quality potion that Russell used on him was so expensive that this potion could be exchanged for a castle. Lyra bowed to him holding an empty plate on a tray, which until recently had been poisoned, and was about to leave the room. The protagonist continued to sit on the bed thinking that, apparently, Russell was a pretty kind man if he fought so hard for his life. At this time, Lyra approached the front door to leave. Calix continued to reason that at least Russell was unlikely to pose a threat to him. Then getting up from the bed, Calix asked if Lyra had left. He grabbed the piece of furniture with a sharp movement and began to stick his fingers deep into his throat to induce vomiting. He tried to make the poison he had recently drunk leave his body the same way it had entered him. Making painful throat sounds, Calix tried to do this, but he failed. Heavily exhaling air from his lungs, he noticed that it was useless, and he urgently needed to find this thing. He understood that the fate of the hero was really a very difficult game, but it had to be somewhere. The main character with an already clouded look began to hastily examine his room. He paid attention to the boxes and books scattered on the floor. After that he moved his gaze to the chest of drawers, which was made of wood in a luxurious style. The main character thought that it was somewhere. The poison began to affect him, and in addition to the clouded look, Calix began to make painful sounds. He was breathing heavily, looking around the room. The system window wrote a standard phrase for this game that his eyelids were getting heavy. The main character cursed loudly. He began to furiously examine the room and throw things in different directions. He asked himself, "Where is it?" After that, he went to the closet and began to throw books in different directions. This whole process was accompanied by swearing from Calix. He furiously asked, "Where is it?" Suddenly Calix's body began to give way and he fell onto the parquet in his room. He lay around scattered things, and looking in front of him he asked himself, if he died like this now, would he be able to start all over again? After that, he assumed, or would he really die? When his energy was running out, then with barely open eyes he paid attention to the object that was opposite him. He opened his eyes wider. In the reflection of his eyes a bright white vessel was visible. The main character asked what it was. He saw that between two chests of drawers on the floor there was a clearly hidden or forgotten white vessel that was located several meters from Calix, lying on the floor. Continuing to look at this vessel, Calix said that the protagonist's body was shaking from pain and the feeling of approaching death, but he still managed to crawl to the chest of drawers, pushing his hand between them to get this mysterious item. Calix thought, what could it be? He took this small vase with his hand, starting to gradually pull it out from there. His face had already turned quite pale, and he was covered in copious drops of sweat. Calix opened the vase in his shaking hands, removing the lid. Then the protagonist approached his face to the container, carefully sniffing the contents of it. Calix screamed in disgust that it was disgusting. He removed this vase away from his face, sticking out his tongue in disgust, wondering what kind of thing it could even be, because it tasted like spoiled milk. The game reality system immediately sent a system window, where it was said that it really was spoiled goat's milk. The protagonist could literally smell the disgusting stench coming from that vase. After reading the system notification, Calix indignantly asked himself in his mind, is this really goat's milk? The protagonist remembered that while playing this Fiend of Hell, he learned that regular yogurt was an antidote to this poison. Calix was completely overwhelmed by the realization that it seemed he would have to drink this in order to survive. He lowered his head down, thinking about it with horror. The protagonist asked himself, could spoiled milk be called yogurt? He raised his face, directing his gaze to the vase, which still smelled disgusting. His time was running out, which he was immediately reminded of by the system, again sending a notification that his eyelids were getting heavy, which meant that time was running out. Seeing this system window, Calix cursed in his mind, thinking that the warning message had appeared for the third time already, and this did not bode well. He sighed heavily, and his body began to tremble more and more, which did not subside, tormenting all parts of his body. Calix knew that he had almost no time left. Sighing heavily, he nevertheless decided to take a desperate step. Gathering all his strength into a fist, the protagonist nevertheless rose, clenching his teeth and lifting his vase higher. He mentally addressed Alira, telling her to watch, because he would definitely take revenge on her. Overcoming the urge to vomit, Calyx nevertheless put the vase with this disgusting liquid and drank everything to the bottom, immediately starting to empty it all back. A few moments later, the protagonist lost consciousness, and when he came to, he was already in his bed. The first thing he saw was Russell, who worriedly asked him if he was awake. Russell leaned over Calyx, watching him gradually come to his senses. Calyx opened his eyes in surprise, asking, "What happened?" He was lying in bed again, covered with a blanket, not understanding what was happening. He said that he had a déjà vu, so he asked, "What does this all mean?" Russell immediately asked him, "What is he talking about?" He was still standing over his bed, and then remembered something else, shouting with displeasure, asking Calyx, "What kind of a mess was that?" Indeed, after that story with the poison, there were a lot of things lying on the floor in the prince's room that should not have been there. Russell pointed to this pogrom, asking the prince, what did he do there? But now Calyx did not care much. He mentally thanked Russell for saving him, but Russell was not going to stop asking questions just like that. He menacingly asked, why was the prince lying on the floor? But the protagonist, apparently, decided to dodge all the questions, simply turning away in the other direction, happy only with the thought that he managed to survive. Russell meanwhile was still scolding him, saying that no matter how hard he tried to wake him up, he still wouldn't wake up. The old knight even mentioned that he almost called a healer because of this. Calyx thought that he didn't want to feel this noose around his neck anymore, while the butler was still cursing at him somewhere in the background. The protagonist's face turned pale, when he finally realized that he had just recently escaped death. Calyx thought that, no matter what happened, he would definitely survive. He frowned and his eyes acquired a shade of determination. The protagonist thought that if she, the countess, decided to do this again, then he first needed to check the status of the person in front of him. Calyx turned his gaze to Russell, carefully studying his face and body, launching a system window with information about him. And while Russell unsuccessfully tried to shout to the prince, asking him if he was even listening to him, Prince Calyx read information about him from the system window. It said that the man in front of him was named Russell Nizzle. His age was 58 years old, he was a viscount, belonged to Shaken County, his occupation was acting count, and his affiliation was serious soldier. He was currently in a normal state, his combat strength was 4 stars out of 7, his reputation was 72 points, and his skills were E-rank administration, F-rank finance, B-rank military, E-rank diplomacy, and E-rank development. Calyx thoughtfully read in his mind that this man was the acting count. He immediately wondered if this meant that he was the temporary count because the previous count died without choosing a successor. Calyx sat on his bed, continuing to stare at the system window in silence, while Russell also looked at him silently. The protagonist thought that since he was a serious soldier, he could trust him a little. His gaze became slightly suspicious, and he thought that he was his benefactor, who saved his dying body with a potion of the highest quality. At first, Calyx addressed Russell by name, and then corrected himself, calling him Aaron's representative. Russell immediately responded, leaning slightly towards the prince to better hear his weakened voice. The protagonist said that if he was honest, he had something to tell him. Russell looked at him carefully, and then Calyx began to tell him everything he knew and assumed about his recent fake suicide. Russell continued to listen attentively. At the end of the protagonist's story, he said that he was very sorry, because there was no proof of what happened to him. He put his hand to his mouth, holding his other hand with his other. Russell looked down at him, thinking about what he should do. Calyx looked at him in confusion, cursing in his mind, thinking that even though he used such a valuable potion on him, this man did not treat him as someone special at all. The protagonist frowned, gritting his teeth, thinking that Russell was simply following the family rules by helping him. Russell closed his eyes and said that the prince was just another successor to him, so he had to honestly and hardworkingly serve the prince. Calyx clutched his blanket, hearing that without witnesses and proof, the man could not do anything. The protagonist irritatedly said that this medicine was sent by someone who intended to take the place of the head of this county. His gaze filled with anger as he asked Russell in a confident voice, did this mean that he should continue drinking what he was given? Well, she decided to clarify once again, did Calyx really lose his memories? The protagonist frowned upon hearing this question. Russell continued to say that the Shaken Count family was currently in serious financial trouble, so their budget was very limited. Hearing this, Calyx pursed his lips, nervously listening to Russell. The old soldier said that Lyra had always done most of the work in the family, so they couldn't be so ungrateful to her. He closed his eyes tiredly, trying to explain this to the prince, asking him if he really didn't remember it. Or was he just pretending to have lost his memory? Calyx clutched the blanket in his hands again, thinking that he had no choice but to give Russell evidence. He was lost in his thoughts, thinking that the girl who poisoned him must have thought that he was already dead. The protagonist tilted his head down, saying that they needed to stop talking about this. Russell looked at him in surprise, and then the protagonist lifted his head up, saying that he had a request. A sly smile appeared on his face, and his eyes filled with confidence again. Calix said that this request was not so difficult. Russell silently looked at the prince, thinking that it really did not seem to him that Calix was behaving at all differently than usual. 4 hours later, in the castle of Count Shaken, the sky began to gradually brighten. The morning was coming to these parts, bringing with it the sunlight. Only one small figure in this morning's silence moved accurately and quickly along the walls of the castle, now and then jumping from place to place in order to remain unnoticed. It was a liar, and landing on the right spot, she sighed heavily, trying to catch her breath, covering her face with a large collar so that no one would recognize her in these robes. Standing behind one of the walls, she looked out, watching the knights who guarded one of the entrances to the castle. Lyra thought that the security system was really decently strengthened. She frowned, then turning her gaze to a small hole with a grate in the wall, deciding to get inside with this. Using this secret passage, the liar disappeared inside, literally from the ceiling to the floor. Once inside, she immediately began to quietly sneak up to Prince Calix's room, surprised to think that there were no guards nearby. Quietly opening the door, she looked inside hesitantly, seeing that Calix was lying quietly in bed. She went inside, coming closer to the bed, looking at how quietly her victim was lying there. Lyra removed the hood of her cloak, thinking that it was a special poison, so she was sure that he died painlessly. She narrowed her eyes, carefully examining the crime scene. Lyra then took out a document with a will from her pocket, which was a suicide note. Putting it on the desk, she pulled out a drawer, taking out a large seal from there. Gently taking the seal in her hand, she put it on the paper with the suicide note, thinking that now it was ready. Now she only had to finish the task. Her gaze was filled with seriousness and regret at the same time from the deed she had done. But no one was going to let her go so quickly. As soon as she did this, Russell, who was sitting in ambush all this time, abruptly came out from there, approaching Lyra from behind. In just a few moments, a sharp sword was presented to her neck. This shocked her to horror. Russell in a cold tone told her not to move from the spot. Lyra immediately thought that she knew that voice. She could not see the man behind her, but she felt perfectly well who it was. Lyra sweated nervously, but then, when she came to her senses, her look acquired a shade of irritation and disgust. She clenched her teeth, clicking her tongue. Lyra screamed that it was too late. Her voice was confident, because she thought that the main character was no longer alive. She turned her gaze to the side, looking at where, in her opinion, the dead body of Calix should lie, on that very bed. Lyra screamed that Prince Calix was already dead. Indeed, the blanket did not move. Calix lay absolutely motionless. Lyra said that the county of Shaken now belonged to Boris. Lyra called Lord Russell by name. Meanwhile, he towered behind her, looking at her with a stern look. Lyra was still scared, but did not show it. She and Russell were silent for a few seconds, but then she spoke again, asking him if he shouldn't be watching Shaken County, not the weak and frail prince. She turned her gaze behind her back, wanting to understand what Russell was going through now. But the man only remained silent, and then the main characters decided to show themselves. Calix, loudly saying that he was still a genius, got up from the bed, coming closer to the place where the two were standing. Lyra looked at Prince Calix in surprise, because she did not expect to see him there alive. Lyra said in confusion, "What does this mean?" and horror and incomprehension were reflected in her eyes. Calix read the contents of the suicide note that Lyra brought, saying that it mentioned poison slow death. He laughed, saying that it was very interesting. The main character with a smile leaned his hand on the desk, continuing to read what was written, putting his other hand on his thigh. Calix said that poisoning was not uncommon in the secret struggles for power between noble families. Lyra listened to him, still not fully understanding what was happening. She realized that she had fallen into their trap. Calix said that he was well aware of this, taking the note into his hands, continuing to read the contents of it. But then he objected with a detached look, saying that if the world found out about this, then he thought it would be very unpleasant. He smiled, looking at the reaction of the maid. However, Lyra was not going to give in to her enemy so easily. She took hold of the hilts of her daggers, cursing loudly out loud, sharply squatting down, at the same time fighting off Russell's grip, thereby knocking his sword out of his hands. She tried to run away, but her hand was immediately caught again by Russell's strong hand, holding Lyra in place. Lyra screamed in pain, closing her eyes. Well, Russell wasn't going to stop there, so he swung his hand, with one sharp movement of his fist, dealing a strong blow to the girl's stomach. Lyra screamed loudly again, unable to do anything to counter. Calix thought that he roughly understood this, however, now he clearly saw what a difference of 3 classes was. The protagonist watched what was happening in surprise, remaining on the sidelines. He thought that Russell really was scary. This huge man towered over the defeated opponent, as if he was not made of human flesh at all, but of stone. Clearing his throat, the protagonist put a card in his hand, saying that, as he said, poisoning is a common method of murder, but only a fool would leave behind material evidence and a witness. The whole situation looked rather ridiculous, because two men stood over the injured killer lying on the floor and continued to calmly talk. The protagonist said that anyone who tried to kill the twins would be sentenced to death. Lyra was breathing heavily, looking up at Calix with hostility. The protagonist continued speaking, saying that this also applied to people of noble blood. He again came closer to the desk, saying that the proof was right there. After all, on the table lay that very paper with the suicide note, judging by which he should have already been dead. Then Calix approached Lyra, putting his foot on her in a dismissive gesture, as if she were a trophy animal, saying that she would be their witness. Calix, with a sly smile on his face, pointed his finger at the evil girl, who was gradually beginning to lose consciousness. When her eyes became so heavy that she could not restrain the desire to close her eyelids, she simply fainted right in front of Russell and Calix. The protagonist looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was happening. He asked to squat down in front of Lyra, looking at her in surprise. Calix asked worriedly what happened to her. Russell remained silent, and then knelt down on one knee, carefully examining it. When Russell realized that the girl had signs of life, he said that she simply lost consciousness. Lyra continued to lie on the floor, and then Russell, putting his hand on her body, used a little of his mana to measure the strength of his opponent. The main characters thought in surprise that this was the core of mana. He looked with interest at what Russell was doing, realizing that now he also knew what class Lyra was. Russell said that he did not think that she knew how to use the mana breathing method. He got up from his knees, straightening up to his full height, while Calix looked at him with interest from below. Russell made a verdict that, apparently, Lyra's level was limited only to good physical data. He looked at the assassin in front of him, telling Calix that in that case, there was no need to use the mana limit on her. Russell then turned his gaze to the protagonist, noticing his expression. Calix was smiling slightly, and there was no fear in his eyes at all. He wondered if Russell might have already known about this. Russell reasoned in his mind that he felt strange when he was asked to hide. He remembered the expression on the protagonist's face when he did so, and how he thought that Calix was acting completely out of character. Russell immediately wondered how much he knew. Calix then stood up on his feet, telling Russell to just tie up Lyra in that case, adding then that he wanted to listen to her moans. After a while, Lyra was tied up on a chair in Prince Calix's room. She was still unconscious, and the hand that Russell grabbed her by was covered in a large hematoma. The protagonist dripped some solution onto the girl's hand, causing a large hematoma on her hand to gradually shrink. Calix carefully wiped her face with a handkerchief, standing with his back to the window, when suddenly Lyra gradually began to wake up. Her gaze was still blurry, but she could already distinguish Calix's silhouette. When she fully regained consciousness, to her surprise, she found herself tied up. Calix spoke slowly, telling her that when he drank the poison, a slow death, he stopped breathing after about a few minutes. Lyra's gaze was filled with fear. She looked at Calix, realizing that now he could do anything to her. The protagonist then continued to speak, telling her that it was the perfect poison for suicide because it allows one to die without feeling any pain. Calix approached Kalira, saying that if he, who had previously tried to leave for another world, had knocked out her poison, he was almost certain that everyone would 100% believe that he himself had chosen this path. Calix smiled a sly smile, throwing the handkerchief he had previously used to wipe Lyra out of his hands. He then turned to Lyra, saying that they would use a fast-acting poison on her. He also added that if she had been willing to die with him, then she would not have lost. Calix stood in front of the girl, continuing to tell her about this. The protagonist quickly approached her with one sharp movement, took her by the chin and asked why she did this. There was a threat in his gaze, and a primal fear in the girl's eyes. She asked Calix what he meant. The prince's hand was still clutching her face, and Russell watched the protagonist's actions closely. Calix said that he did not think this body wanted to die. He let go of her face, asking her, was she really so devoted to Countess Stella that she was ready to sacrifice her life? Lyra lowered her gaze down, not daring to look Calix in the eyes. But he did not wait for her answer, saying that, no matter what, he would still do what he had planned. Lyra raised her eyes to him, clenching her teeth. The protagonist turned his gaze behind Lyra's back and ordered Russell to open her mouth. Russell agreed, starting to carry out the order, and Lyra helplessly screamed, that was very naive. Russell pressed on the girl's cheeks with his thumbs, forcing her to keep her mouth open. She fixed her frightened eyes on the prince, who was holding some strange object in his hands. She muttered inaudibly, asking him what it was. The prince had a handkerchief on his palm, with a small poisonous ball on it. He immediately threw it into Lyra's mouth, letting her smell the disgusting odor that came from the vessel from which he had previously drunk sour goat's milk. The protagonist poured this disgusting mixture right into the girl's mouth, Calix shouted at Russell to make her swallow it all. Russell accepted the order, covering the girl's mouth, forcing her to swallow it. The girl tried to break free, grunting in displeasure, squeezing the armrests of the chair in her hands. But still, she had no choice, and she had to swallow it. Lyra cleared her throat, feeling a disgusting taste in her mouth. She asked warily, what kind of nasty thing was that? She looked at the protagonist with a hostile look, and he only calmly answered her that he had already said that it was poison. He closed the vase in his hands, lowering his gaze to it. Lyra carefully asked, what kind of poison is this? There was horror and anger on her face at the same time, but what the protagonist said next only shocked her even more. The protagonist said that it was the poison of the puppet of Sadiza. It was a strong poison that was not so easy to obtain. Lyra rose up in her chair, shouting that this could not be. She was surprised how such a frail, useless child managed to get something like this. Calix replied that as long as he had gold coins in his pocket, he could get anything. His gaze was filled with contempt and disgust at such behavior of the girl. Calix then said that if he had to name the secret ingredient of this poison, he would say it was white radish. When Lyra heard this, her mouth dropped open in amazement, because she clearly could not expect that a good-for-nothing prince could do something like this. But she was not the only one surprised. Russell, hearing about this, was also very surprised, looking intently at Calix, but said nothing. Lyra said irritably that she could not believe it. Her gaze was still full of anger and hatred. She moved her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose, looking at the protagonist. Calix thought that in order to survive in this world, he should not be exposed, and for this he only needed to correctly understand the terminology of this continent. A sly smile appeared on his face, and his eyes narrowed in an equally sly squint. He thought that it was unlikely that people would suspect anything if he got into his role. The protagonist turned away, saying that today he would free her. He ordered Lyra to go to her master and tell him that the assassination was successful. Calix walked to the other end of the room, sitting down on the banquette. Lyra asked him dismissively if he thought she would listen to him. Then the protagonist looked up at her, saying that she would do it because she didn't want to die. Lyra pressed her lips together, sighing heavily as Calix began to explain to her that there were over 3,000 types of antidotes in the seedy puppet, and each of them depended on the method of dosing. He also added that the perfect antidote for her was this thing. The protagonist mockingly pointed his hand at his head, smiling more and more, because now he felt superior to his own killer. Suddenly, the girl felt strange sensations in her body. Calix said that she would not achieve anything with her stubbornness, so she needed to obey him unconditionally. She began to feel a strange tremor inside her. The poison twisted her stomach, which forced her to take an uncomfortable position. Her body was shaking, and noticing this, Calix asked what her answer was. Lyra's face turned red and she was breathing heavily, feeling a great need. Lyra cleared her throat while Russell was looking at her, then, desperately, she began to scream, agreeing to let Calix heal her. She turned to face the prince, feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The protagonist grunted in displeasure and asked her what was that. After all, he was trying to help her. Giving up, Lyra finally began to ask him to decide this quickly, repeating polite words over and over again this time. She began to tremble more, and her face reflected despair and fear and shame. Russell surprisedly thought, why is she so weak-willed? He frowned his brows, and then a loud rumbling of the stomach echoed throughout the room. Lyra again began to beg the protagonist to have mercy on her, trembling all over and already ready to burst into tears right there. Calix thought with a laugh that spoiled goat's milk works without fail. He barely held back his laughter, puffing out his cheeks. Having enjoyed the sight of the widow, the protagonist ordered Russell to untie her. The girl had already shrunk as much as she could to withstand this torture. Reza looked at Calix in surprise, asking him, will everything be okay? After all, this man was trying to kill him. He opened his eyes wide, not understanding how the prince could order such a thing. However, the protagonist only laughed, looking at this, putting his hand to his face. He said that since she was an important witness, they needed to protect her dignity. Russell asked in surprise, how are we talking about dignity? This old soldier did not understand what was happening at all, but Lyra understood it fully, so, cursing loudly, she shouted at Russell to quickly untie her. She turned sharply towards the dim-witted man, feeling the tension growing inside her. Russell looked at her in surprise, and then she spoke carefully, unable to bear it any longer, that it would soon flow. She closed her eyes, which were full of tears, and shouted loudly almost to the whole castle, begging him to finally do it. This morning brought many interesting events. Even the castle was shocked by this. When Lyra dealt with her terrible problems, she knelt before Prince Calix, telling him that she would report to her master that the murder was a success. And yet you were still red from embarrassment because of what happened, but since she was a first-class warrior, Lyra was still able to maintain her dignity. Calix agreed, escorting Lyra out of his room, remaining inside this only with Russell, They stood silently for a few moments next to each other. The protagonist thought that in order to deceive the man who is behind Lyra, he needed to have his own strong horse. The door to the prince's room slammed shut, and then he turned his gaze to Russell, who addressed him. Calix knew that he was likely in for a long, unpleasant conversation. Calix knew perfectly well that Russell probably wanted to ask a lot of things. Russell's face took on a serious tone. He asked where Calix got all this knowledge from. The protagonist fussily replied that he would not believe him even if he said that he had simply read a book. Calix's face immediately gave away his lie, so Russell said that if he read such a book, he would be sentenced to death. His face was so serious that it was obvious that he was not lying at all. The protagonist shuddered, and Russell meanwhile continued speaking, clarifying that he strongly doubted that such a forbidden and dangerous thing would be left in the castle. Calix literally felt a strong chill run through his body. Moreover, the cold was so strong that it seemed to turn into ice. The protagonist understood that Russell would not believe him if he said that he came from another world, and if this happened, he would be considered crazy. Then he came up with a new lie. Calix said that the reason was in the dagger that he stabbed himself in the chest. The protagonist put his hand on the place where he stabbed the dagger, asking Russell if he remembered it. Russell said that he remembered this dagger, but he did not understand. Why did he talk about it? Calix began to walk in the other direction, moving away from the door, saying that this dagger was a family heirloom that he got from his mother. He lied more and more, now inventing that there was a certain legend, that this thing had a mysterious power. However, it was not just a legend. Russell incredulously asked Calix again, is he serious about this? The protagonist thought that Russell still didn't believe it. Then he, frowning his brows, continued to say that no one could think that in order to reveal the secret of this relic, one could only stab oneself in the heart. Russell again said incredulously that it was strange. He looked at the prince, saying that if such a rare thing existed, then the whole world would know about it. Calix closed his eyes, trying to think of at least something else to somehow justify himself. Then he looked away, saying that perhaps Russell knew about Claire's dagger? The protagonist clutched his shirt in his hand, looking at Russell, who chuckled in surprise, asking Calix if he wanted to say that this dagger he received from the great countess was Claire's real dagger. He immediately became inspired, asking Calix about it. Seeing that the trick worked, the protagonist realized that Russell had been caught. He smiled at the corners of his lips, realizing that the lie had worked. Russell enthusiastically began to say that Claire's dagger was a treasure among treasures. And if he really had it, then that would explain everything. The protagonist closed his eyes, sitting down again on the bench in front of his bed, embarrassedly listening to Russell, who had fallen for it too easily. Calix himself knew very well that he had never seen this before. But suddenly Russell objected, causing Calix, who had already relaxed, to flinch. Russell leaned towards the protagonist, threateningly asking with a serious expression, did anyone else know about this? The protagonist sweated nervously, saying that Russell was the first person he had told about it. With a sigh of relief, Russell straightened up again, calmly closing his eyes, saying that if that was the case, then everything was fine. Then Calix turned to him, asking what he thought of the Lyra's story. Russell asked him in surprise, what do you mean? Calix asked that. The protagonist answered that all of his father's movements were exposed. Russell nervously replied that it was. He looked at Calix, not understanding what he wanted to say. The protagonist answered that the knight who was about to reach the 7th grade was attacked and died. Did all the knights on guard also die? Calix's gaze turned cold, and he placed his hand on his knee, thinking about it out loud. The protagonist asked Russell, did he really believe such a stupid story? Russell listened to him carefully, thinking that perhaps Calix needed his strength. But Russell also knew very well that he was forbidden to take sides in the battle for the inheritance. The protagonist rested his head on his hand, looking up at Russell with a thoughtful look. Russell thought, there was also no doubt that Count Colin was killed intentionally. However, in this situation, there was only emotional evidence, not material. Russell shook off this thought, clutching the sheath of his sword. He looked at his wife standing in front of him, thinking that as a soldier, he believed that he should not interfere in politics. He was about to turn to the prince, but Calix suddenly screamed loudly, asking, why did father have to die? He wondered loudly that if it was done intentionally, then who could be behind it? Calix was completely small compared to Russell, but even in him, righteous hatred was seething in the old soldier's eyes. The protagonist asked him, if he knew the identity of this man, then how should he take revenge? The protagonist raised his gaze to Russell, looking at him with a smile in the rays of the morning sun. Hearing about revenge, Russell froze, frowning, and Calix announced that his father and part-time boss for Russell was killed, and the Kosherin family is the organizer of the assassination attempt, and Grand Bane is from this family. Saying this, he stamped his foot on the floor and waving his hand, frowned, shouting that if Grand Bane becomes the count, it will be too late to take revenge, so he ordered that Russell dare not give up just because it looks difficult. After finishing his speech, he fell silent, seriously looking at the interlocutor and waiting for his answer, and decided to ask if he really thinks of himself as a real knight, following the family that killed his lord and tried to kill the direct heir. His gaze was cruel and stern, and Russell even shuddered when the protagonist looked at him. He was silent for a while, not knowing what he should answer, and finally he dropped to one knee, placing his sword in front of him, and swore allegiance to Calix. He simply said his name, and Russell responded immediately, letting him know that he was listening. He added seriously that he had just renounced the beliefs he had held for more than 50 years, and asked that Calix not forget this. The protagonist, smiling slightly, thought that he was a 6th-class strongman and, in addition, the most powerful man in the county, and now he had become his ally. Looking at Russell bowing before him, he imagined the silhouette of a tiger behind him, for he thought of him as this animal, which silently walked along his path. He thought it was a good thing that the reins of revenge were tightened, but out loud he simply asked Russell to raise his head, as he was sure that there was no need to give loyalty to someone who did not even have the title of knight yet. Still keeping his head down, Russell asked him not to worry, promising that he would definitely make him stronger, and added that he was here to help him. His eyes seemed to shine from how determined he was, and Calix, slightly sweating from excitement, chuckled, noticing that there was clearly more to those words. That was why he thought that if he did not change the topic right away, they would immediately begin training, and said that Stella used a vile method, but left behind evidence and a witness, so thanks to this, they would be able to destroy the faction she belonged to. Russell sat opposite, listening attentively, and the protagonist, smirking, declared that this would be the beginning of their revenge. Russell agreed seriously and asked what was required of an old man like him. Smiling wider, Calix decided to tell him what would need to be done now, and for some time they sat in the room behind closed doors, talking. Soon evening came, followed by night, and when morning came, a large number of nobles were sitting in the assembly hall, led by Stella and Grandvine. Stella, covering part of her face with the fan she held in her hands, noticed that everyone had already arrived. Many of the nobles sitting at the edges of the table were curious about why she was sitting on the throne, and, hearing these questions, someone remembered that the knights had been on guard all night. Stella, slyly narrowing her eyes and smiling slightly, assumed that some of them still did not know about one piece of news, and announced that yesterday Prince Calix committed suicide by drinking poison, a slow death. Everyone froze in shock upon hearing this announcement, and Giddles asked if this was not the famous suicide poison. He frowned in worry, and someone asked if it was true that death from this poison was inevitable. Some people just sat there silently, thinking, and one of the men asked if the factions would no longer matter if the first prince died. Hearing this, one of the nobles was horrified, as he needed to establish strong connections. Hearing their worried words, Stella smiled while covering her lips with her fan, and thought that with Calix's death, it was certain that the title of Count would be passed on to Grandbane. She looked at Giddles, who was sitting a little to the side and was sad, and at this moment, someone suddenly asked who would be the next Count. Someone said that it had already been decided, and continuing the discussion, one of the nobles asked if the Countess could be the Count's representative. During all this time, Calix sat in the room next to him, his hands behind his head, and grinned, saying that it was getting more and more interesting. Finally, turning to his interlocutor, he asked if he was ready. Looking slightly to the side, he clarified that he was talking to Russell, and he said that he was ready, promising that he would follow him wherever he went. Placing the sword in front of him, he frowned, calling the protagonist his master, and Stella, at this time, not ceasing to be happy with how everything was working out, looked at Grandbine, who was sitting next to her, who was looking straight ahead with an indifferent expression. Suddenly, the doors to the meeting room swung open, and Calix walked in, causing everyone to freeze in amazement. He walked confidently forward, and Stella, noticing him, frowned, covered in sweat from bewilderment, and made a surprised sound, and everyone in the hall shouted out Calix's name. Not reacting to them yet, the protagonist continued to walk forward, accompanied by Russell, who was walking right behind him. His face was focused, but did not seem worried, and Stella, from the shock she was experiencing, even dropped her fan from her hands and, frowning only more, asked in a stuttering voice, "Why did this happen?" While Calix was passing by them, the nobles were talking among themselves about the fact that he was alive, and also asked why Russell, the acting count, was next to him. Someone already doubted that the protagonist had taken poison, and by this time, he, stopping in front of the enraged Stella, attracted her attention and, pointing his finger in her direction, shouted that the throne on which she was now sitting did not belong to her. He frowned, and she, suddenly calming down, smiled cruelly, saying that she was still a countess, and asked how Calix was feeling. He smiled too, saying that he drank poison because of one person, but fortunately survived, because he immediately vomited. He confessed that he was too impatient, and dissatisfied with what he heard. Stella could not contain her emotions and frowned furiously, slightly lowering her head and looking seriously at Calix standing in front of her, who, despite her stern look, sighed, looking at her slyly. And Stella declared that misleading people without fully verifying your words is absolutely terrible. Jumping up from her seat, she leaned her palms on the table and exclaimed, although the protagonist did not recognize her as his mother, but now he treats her like a murderer, and she cannot forgive him for this attitude. However, Calix did not react to these words, but simply scratched his ear with his finger in boredom, and Stella at that moment continued to shout, reminding him that this was a large hall, so here he should be responsible for what he said. Calix's expression became not just bored, but also displeased, but he quickly changed it to a smile and asked if she could continue to behave like this even if the truth was revealed. While he was speaking, Russell stood next to him, his head down, and Stella, continuing to frown, asked herself what he was planning. She asked out loud why he said these words. Calix understood something and, having announced it to everyone, clapped his hands several times, and Lyra was brought into the hall, her wrists tied with a rope behind her back. She walked without resisting, and Calix offered to listen to what the witness would tell them. While Lyra, with her head down, passed by the nobles, and the knight held her by the rope that bound her hands, the nobles began to talk among themselves and asked discontentedly, "Who is this woman?" Stella, recognizing her, mentally exclaimed that this could not be, and clenched her jaw, unable to cope with her emotions. She also cursed mentally, and Lyra, having reached the place where Calix stood, fell to her knees a little to the side and behind him, continuing to hold her head down. The protagonist, looking at her seriously, asked what her name was. Lyra did not answer right away, but at first simply made an uncertain sound, and Grandbein looked at her in surprise, but in the end Lyra announced her name. Stella, whose face was covered in sweat from excitement, asked herself, why did this happen? She wondered why she was here, and without hiding her anger and despair, she clenched her jaw so hard that the veins on her forehead became clearly visible. At this point, Lyra continued speaking, announcing that she was a member of the 1st Special Forces Unit, which is called the Power of Darkness and belongs to the Koshirin family. Calix, hearing about the Power of Darkness, repeated the name of this organization, hinting that it was necessary to tell about it in more detail. His face remained serious as she explained that they were a special unit made up of children with high combat abilities who were undergoing extreme training at the plateau camp. The best of the best were selected from those who could handle all the training there, and these children hid their identities in order to carry out various missions in different parts of the continent. After she finished saying this, Calix asked who she was pretending to be within the walls of Shaken County. Without hiding anything, she answered that she was Countess Stella's maid, and upon hearing this, Stella only clenched her jaw tighter, unable to hold back a dissatisfied cry, and trembled from how many emotions she was currently experiencing. However, she remained silent without saying anything, and the protagonist, after standing there silently looking at her for a while, turned his attention back to Lyra and asked if Stella was aware of her true identity. Lowering her head, she confirmed that Calix's assumption was correct, and Stella, frowning, began to protest, trying to convince everyone that this was a conspiracy. One of the nobles, remembering that Lyra had served this family for more than 5 years, desperately admitted that he could not even believe that she was a spy. Many remembered that impersonating another person was a blatant violation of the royal law, and therefore some proposed to officially vote against the Koshirin family, but some were still against it and asked what they were doing. They reminded that they did not have any material evidence, but someone declared that this was not a problem, since Calix had a witness. Giddles, listening to everything that was happening around him, froze, covered in sweat from the tension, and cursed, frowning, and then, drawing Russell's attention to himself, asked why he was silent. He asked if he really believed the story of this humble servant. Hearing him, Calix turned in his direction, and then looked expectantly at Russell, who, seriously turning his gaze to Giddles, announced that Lyra was not a humble servant at all, but a criminal caught red-handed, and now she confessed to being a spy for the Koshirin family. Hearing these words, the protagonist raised one eyebrow contentedly, sighing, and Russell said that all the nobles should listen to the testimony and then decide for themselves whether all this was a conspiracy or not. Giddles, trembling, desperately tried to object, shouting out the name Russell, but at that moment one of the aristocrats, unable to bear it, ordered him to calm down, and he, indignant at what he heard, asked again in bewilderment, and the aristocrats asked, "Isn't this the word of a sinner?" They offered to listen to her story to the end, and many agreed with it, and Giddles, sighing, mentally addressed Stella, looking at her with excitement. Russell at this point continued to question Lyra and asked what her mission was. Stella only frowned more, but this time she remained silent, and Lyra said that she had to write reports every month, and the protagonist, whose face seemed to darken from how serious he was, asked what these reports were about. She mainly wrote about the county expense book created by the chief treasurer Giddles, and also reconnoitered the route of the late Earl Colin and wrote about the political moods among the vassals. Listening to these words, Russell bowed his head more deeply, his expression became much more stern, and his eyes were hidden in shadow. All the nobles, listening to Lear's confession, were shocked and cursed, and the protagonist, turning so as to look at her directly, and not turning his head, asked what was her last mission. She immediately answered that she had to make Prince Calyx drink poison slow death, and then sneak into his bedroom in order to disguise his death as suicide and leave a fake will. Having said these words, she slightly raised her head, frowning seriously, and Calyx, looking down on her, asked what was the result of what happened. She announced that she managed to make him drink poison, but when she sneaked into his bedroom, she was noticed by the deputy of the Earl Russell. Grandvine, listening to all this, froze in excitement, and Stella trembled, and at that moment Lyra said that after that she was caught. Unable to bear it, she furiously ordered her to shut her mouth, and starting to climb over the table, asked if there was any evidence. She did not even hide her mood, and Grandbane and Garrett, who were sitting next to her, tried to stop her, asking her to calm down. Still resisting, Stella shouted that this was some kind of conspiracy, and the protagonist smiled weakly, realizing that she was demanding proof. He said the name Russell, attracting his attention, and he, closing his eyes, understood what Calyx wanted from him, and expressing his agreement with the order, moved forward a little, after which, frowning, he showed everyone the scroll on which the fake will of Prince Calyx was written. He said that he had caught Lyra the previous night, who had entered Calyx's room and left this will, and then he gravely showed another scroll that he held in his hands and announced that it was the scroll known to all of them, called the Memory of the Earth, which had the property of reproducing the evil thoughts of those who touched it in the form of images. The nobles froze in amazement upon hearing this, and Giddles became more restless and sad, and Russell announced that with the help of this magic scroll they were able to find out who had given the instructions to the spy. Giddles decided that it was necessary to prevent a leak at all costs, and looked worriedly to the side a little, and the other noble, also frightened, thought that it was necessary to shut Calyx's mouth immediately. The protagonist was silent for a while, frowning slightly, and, looking thoughtfully at Giddles and the nobleman, he thought that they could see everything with their own eyes. Turning sharply to the side, he waved his hand, seriously telling the rest of the people to come in. Giddles shuddered, turning his head, and at that moment the doors to the hall opened again and a squad of knights entered. The nobles asked in bewilderment, what kind of jokes were these? The knights at that moment dispersed throughout the hall, and stood one behind each of the nobles. Some men indignantly shouted that this place was not for people like these knights, but someone reminded that security on the castle grounds was the sacred duty of knights. Noticing the warriors standing behind her, Stella frowned, clenching her teeth in annoyance, and for a while everyone in the hall was silent, assessing the situation, until Giddles, turning to Russell, finally asked, what did this mean? Closing his eyes, Russell said that he had already checked the scroll, admitting that he was very shocked by its contents. There was a high probability of a breach of order, and that was why he decided to take precautions right away, and announced this to all the nobles. Looking at the knights holding their shields in front of them, he asked the others to understand him correctly, and Stella guessed why they called the soldiers to the sacred Great Hall, and shouted that it was a coup. Grandvine, whose face was covered in sweat from excitement, trembled and cried, drawing Stella's attention to himself with a trembling voice. She did not answer him, but lowered her head, seriously thinking that the fact that the knights, who had remained neutral until now, began to act was absolute proof, and if they really decided to support Calyx, then everything was very bad, since she could not do anything more. Understanding this only made her frown deeper, causing wrinkles to appear at the corners of her eyes and on her nose. Meanwhile, Calyx, looking at Russell, slightly raised his head, smiling, and asked if he by any chance knew what punishment awaited a nobleman who tried to kill the direct heir of a noble family. Giddles, slightly leaning towards him, answered that according to the royal noble law, the gallows awaited this nobleman. Stella, imagining a noose around her neck, abruptly turned a little to the side, hugging Grandvine to herself, and desperately screamed that he knew nothing about anything. Drops of saliva flew out of her mouth, and she admitted that she had planned all this herself. Grandvine, still frightened by what was happening, continued to cry, and sadly looked at Stella, who hugged him to herself. She, meanwhile, drawing Calyx's attention to herself, noted that she was still his mother, even if they were not related by blood. She asked Calyx to have mercy on Grandvine, but without answering, Calyx simply looked seriously at Lyra, who sat next to her, frowning, and nodded slightly. Returning his attention to Stella, Calyx smiled and laughed, asking if what she was saying was true. Drawing Lyra's attention to himself, he asked if it was true. She said, when she received the task from Stella to kill the prince, Prince Grandvine was with them. Calyx smiled, and Stella only frowned more, and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. In a stuttering voice, she addressed Calyx, and then shouted that it was all a lie. Tears were already flowing down her cheeks, and she hugged the head of the frightened Grandvine tighter to herself, and the protagonist, continuing to smile, thought that this was indeed a blatant lie, but no one would believe Stella anymore. All that she heard made the knights grab her, pressing her to the table so that she would calm down and not resist. Calix, watching her, thought with regret that the man who tried to commit murder turned out to be an ordinary coward, and mentally noted that now his plan was over. At that moment, Stella, frowning furiously, clenched her teeth, raised her head, and looked at him. Tears continued to flow down her cheeks, and Granbine, squinting, tried not to look at everything that surrounded him, while the protagonist, grinning contentedly, called everything that happened today a fox hunt. He remained silent for a while, narrowing his eyes contentedly, and Stella, looking at him, cursed desperately. Suddenly, Granbine, abruptly rising, leaned his palms on the table and called out to Calix, attracting his attention. The protagonist was surprised by such behavior and looked at him in bewilderment, and he, continuing to stand, fell silent for a while, hesitantly looking at him. Stella, noticing her son's behavior, called out to him, turning in his direction, and Granbine left the table, and Calix turned his head to follow his movements. Approaching him, he passed by the side and stood right in front of him, kneeling down. Russell continued to frown, not showing his surprise, and Calix was still looking at Granbine with a puzzled expression. The nobles were also surprised, watching him sit on one knee in front of the protagonist, his head hanging low, and shouting his name. Some cursed, but Granbine, ignoring the shouts around him, said Calix's name and promised that he would accept any punishment, but asked that he forgive Stella. She froze in surprise, but her expression softened slightly. But soon she began to shout again and ordered her son to return to his place. Granbine continued to ignore her, and the nobles began to mutter among themselves, thinking that this was too much, since the second prince even knelt down. However, the other nobles told such dissatisfied people to shut up, otherwise Calix might ask them to. Someone called Granbine noble, since he was going to accept punishment in order to save his mother. The protagonist looked at the nobles and noticed that the wind had changed, so now everyone thought that he was the criminal. Looking at Granbine's concentrated expression, he wondered if he was seriously trying to achieve just this. He clenched his jaw and lowered his chin slightly, but soon leaned towards Granbine, placing his hand on Granbine's shoulder and agreed to his terms. He looked at his good-natured smiling face in surprise, and Calix added that Granbine was so worried about his mother that he couldn't do anything. Granbine asked hopefully what this meant. The protagonist's expression hardened, and he stood up, promising to mitigate Stella's sentence if Granbine admitted his guilt, and after his confession, he would try to negotiate with the deputy count to cancel the death sentence. Granbine was no longer so confident and froze, clenching his teeth, and Calix warned him to keep in mind that he could not change what was said here, and therefore advised him to be more selective in his statements. Granbine had already started to speak, about to confess, but at that moment Stella shouted that she was protesting, and jerking forward, asked what Granbine was doing. She ordered him not to say anything unnecessary, and angry, shouted Calix's name, pointing her fingers in his direction. The veins became visible on her face again. She frowned and did not even hide her despair, noting that although he was not her biological son, he should not order his elder. The nobles were shocked by what they heard and displeasedly noted that Stella and Granbine still did not understand the full gravity of the situation, despite the fact that they tried to kill Prince Calix. Giddles, only becoming more agitated, noticed that the wind of doubt had finally changed, and asked himself why Stella was making unnecessary movements. Drawing Calix's attention to herself, she asked him to listen to her, but the protagonist simply frowned in displeasure and, pursing his lips, looked at Russell, pointing a finger in his direction. Understanding the reason for his indignation and the meaning of the gesture he showed, Russell ordered 2 knights standing a little to the side to arrest the criminal. The warriors agreed with the order and approached Stella, and she, turning in their direction, cried out in amazement, ordering them to stop, and asked how they dared to behave so rudely. Granbine looked at her with agitation, mentally addressing her, and his face became even more sweaty from the strain. Meanwhile, the knights used a special gag that they inserted into Stella's mouth so that she would not say anything more. She tried to shout something, but only incomprehensible sounds came out, and Granbine, listening to this, closed his eyes, pressing his lips tighter. When the knights finished calming Stella, the protagonist attracted Granbine's attention and offered to continue their conversation. He looked at him seriously and asked if he admitted that he tried to poison him. For some time, Granbine still doubted and sat with clenched jaws, but in the end, closing his eyes, lowered his head and confessed to the crime. Calix finally understood how things really were, and assumed that Granbine was trying to pity him, after which he asked himself if he really believed in his pathetic appearance so much. He announced out loud that he understood everything, and said that since Granbine admitted his guilt, the magical scroll of the memory of the lands, which was capable of tarnishing the honor of the family, would not be used. He extended his hand to the side, frowning, and added that since Granbine confessed before the evidence was revealed, his sentence would be mitigated, but in order to do so, to truly ensure that the sinner repents, he must personally seal his mana core right now. Granbine looked at him desperately, understanding what such a punishment meant, and cried out in amazement, and the protagonist thought that the Kingdom of Rock was a land of knights, which was a strict class society, and so the entire kingdom was divided into nobles, knights, commoners, and slaves. The only way to rise to the top positions and become a knight was to use mana to strengthen one's body. Sealing one's mana core was called a social death penalty by many in this world, and understanding all of this, Grandbein turned towards Stella, desperately reaching out to her in his thoughts. Clenching his jaw and frowning in fear, he wondered what he should do. Stella, tears welling up in her eyes again, tried to speak, but the gag prevented her from making any coherent sounds. Grandbein knew that if he did not seal his own mana core, Stella's sins would be revealed, meaning she would be hanged. He imagined his mother's corpse hanging from a rope, and decided that he would not allow that to happen. Stella began to twitch, trying to break free from the knight's grip, and tried to speak again, and the warriors ordered her to stop squirming. She, desperately turning to Grandbein in her thoughts, asked him not to do this, as sealing the core was a death sentence for all nobles. However, he, having already decided everything, sighed, closed his eyes, and standing up, asked Calix and Russell to promise that they would definitely soften the sentence for Stella. He frowned, looking at them seriously, and Russell, closing his eyes, also frowned, promising that he would do everything. In the end, they decided to begin, and after agreeing, someone extended a hand in which there was a scroll, and inserted it into Grandbein's mouth. He stood there without resisting, and raising his hands stopped his palms in front of his stomach, starting to activate magical energy. The mana core located inside him shone, becoming visible, and Stella, crying, mentally asked him to stop. She tried to say something, but nothing came out, and she thought that if the core was sealed, even the Grand Master would not be able to stop it, so Grandbein's future would be in danger. At that moment, still holding the scroll in his teeth, he jerked his hand sharply, tearing off part of it, after which he froze, humbly lowering his head. Calix frowned seriously during this entire time, pressing his lips tighter, and watched him. The center of Grandbein Koshurin's abdomen began to glow with a bright golden color. The core that was in the center of his abdomen poured out magical energy from itself, and many streams of magical energy that glowed with a bright golden color swirled around it. Grandbein Koshurin, with a tense expression on his face, clenched his palm into a fist, squeezing his eyes shut. Beads of sweat flowed down his face at this moment. Magical energy was concentrated in the main core that was illuminated by a golden light. Soon this core began to fade little by little, losing its brightness. It became smaller and smaller, and in a short period of time it became almost invisible. In the center of Grandbein Koshurin's large abdomen, only a small glowing spark was formed. All the nobles in the hall looked at the situation with puzzled expressions on their faces. They all thought that the mana core had just been sealed. These nobles had their eyes wide open and their mouths slightly open in surprise. Countess Stella looked in front of her in pain, in a hysterical state. Her mouth was covered with a massive gag, and only because of this the whole hall was not filled with her loud screams. Voluminous streams of tears flowed down her cheeks that flowed out of her eyes. Grandbein Koshurin, touching his stomach, noted out loud that it turned out it was not as painful as he thought, and now his mother's life was not in danger. Countess Stella sobbed, thinking that it was all over. She made loud sobbing sounds, even taking into account that her mouth was closed. Looking at her son, she thought that he was still very naive. Grandbein at this time looked at his mother with a confused expression on his face. He turned to Countess Stella and asked her not to worry about him so much. He told her with a smile on his face that he still wanted to become an artist. Countess Stella, in incredible rage, began to tense her neck and jaw. She squeezed the object that was in her mouth tighter and tighter. She shouted through her teeth, "Calix." Then she strained her neck to such an extent that the metal chain that was on the object that covered her mouth broke. Immediately after that, in a mad state with a purple face and bright shining eyes from rage, opening her mouth as wide as possible, Countess Stella shouted to Calix that she would curse him for the rest of her life. Then she began to scold him rudely and scream, asking, "How dare he?" The protagonist stood in the center of the hall with a calm expression and understood that a person without mana would be able to climb to the 3rd class at best. That is, if Grandbein Koshurin was lucky, he would reach the level of Lyra. When he thought about this, he looked at the emotionless and serious expression on the face of Lyra, who was tied up and sitting in the center of the hall. Then the protagonist turned his attention to how Grandbein ran up to his sobbing mother and began to shout loudly, "Mom!" Countess Stella at this time was lying on the floor in a completely broken emotional state and did nothing but sob loudly. Calix thought that, however, now he felt like a worthless person who had killed the future of a young nobleman. Calix looked ahead with an upset and tired expression on his face. Then he began to frantically twist his head from side to side, repeatedly telling himself that this was not so. He explained to himself that after all, he was only a game character, and if he showed even a little pity, it would certainly subsequently reflect on him in some negative way. Russell looked questioningly at Calix, who was acting strangely and for no reason began to turn his head from side to side. Looking at this, Russell mentally asked himself, what was wrong with him? The main character noticed Russell's gaze and, looking at him in surprise, interrupted his thoughts and stopped taking any unusual actions. He thought that the path he had chosen for himself had already become final and he would not be able to turn back. The main character coughed into his fist and began to behave calmly. Russell continued not to take his eyes off him, after which Calix officially addressed the deputy of Count Russell and suggested that he deal with the rest. The two of them stood in the center of the hall and looked at Grand Bane Kosherin and Countess Stella, who were under guard, surrounded by 2 guards. After this, Russell said, addressing Grand Bane Kosherin and Countess Stella, he told them that they were under arrest until the end of the investigation. At that moment, Grand Bane Kosherin and Countess Stella looked at him with tired and upset expressions on their faces as he spoke. Immediately after that, Russell loudly ordered to lock them in the dungeon. He then said that from now on, these 2 are forbidden to contact anyone. Russell passed by Grand Bane Kosherin looking after him. Grand Bane Kosherin and Countess Stella were taken to the dungeon by the guards. Calix looked at them, then Russell turned to the treasurer Giddles. He told him that he was accused of leaking and distributing secret financial documents. Old man Giddles looked up at him with a frightened expression on his face. Russell looked at him menacingly and pointed his index finger at him, and shouted at him that he was removed from his position and detained for further instructions. After that, turning to the guards, he ordered them to arrest the sinner. The guards immediately grabbed Giddles by the arms and began to carry him away. With a frightened and confused expression on his face, Giddles asked them to stop. After that, he shouted that he was not guilty. Some time after that, he turned to the knights who were dragging him away and called them stupid knights. One of the knights tensed up from the insult he heard. Giddles continued to scream, asking how they dared to touch him with their dirty ones. He did not have time to finish because the offended knight instantly hit him in the stomach with his fist, which made Giddles make a loud painful sound and then did not show any signs of life, thereby giving the guards the opportunity to calmly take him away to the dungeon. Calix, who was watching this situation, noted that now he understood that in the future he would not anger the knights. Other noblemen who were sitting at the table in the hall fearfully asked, would they really be arrested too? The nobles began to talk to each other with concern. One of them noticed that in any case, Prince Calix had neither a title nor support, but he still noticed that the Razzle was waiting for his instructions. They concluded that it seemed that now all the knights were on the prince's side. They understood that this meant only one thing, that the question of succession was closed. The protagonist confidently stood next to Russell and looked at the nobles surrounding him. One of these nobles noticed that Viscount Russell even bowed his head in front of all of them. The protagonist watched the actions of the frightened nobles who were sitting on their chairs around him. The nobles were shouting in fear that this was definitely a warning from Prince Calix to all of them. The protagonist, with a satisfied expression on his face and a laughing grin, watched the reactions of the nobles. Russell shouted loudly, "The commander of the guard." The commander of the guard, with a frightened expression on his face, instantly cursed when he was addressed. Russell came up to him and, frowning, loudly told him that his duties were suspended and that he was under arrest pending further investigation. After that, Russell, looking him intently in the eyes, asked him to refrain from communicating with other people so that no misunderstandings would arise. The security commander, frightened and at the same time confused, answered that he understood him. The aristocrats watched the events unfolding in horror. They put their hands in front of themselves in fear that the same fate would befall them. A loud voice sounded. It was Garrett Olson, who said that he was very sorry. Garrett Olson bowed his head down while continuing to sit on the chair and said that due to his carelessness, the shoots of betrayal were not pulled out at the root. After that, Garrett Olson turned to Calix and Russell and asked them to approve his dismissal at his own request. The protagonist, looking at Garrett Olson, thought that he not only had excellent abilities, but also a good reputation among his subordinates. Calix understood perfectly well that if he did not find the right words, then favorable circumstances could end. The protagonist understood that it was good that they had talked about this with Russell in advance. Russell, with a serious expression on his face, looking at Garrett Olson, called him the head of administrative affairs and informed him that his request for resignation was rejected. After that, documents were handed over through the guard Garrett Olson. Russell told him that this was a list of people who were involved in the attempted murder. The documents that the guard was holding in his hands consisted of a huge number of written papers. Garrett Olson looked at it with an interested expression on his face. Russell continued to tell him that all the listed employees were ceasing their work and would soon be removed from their positions. Garrett Olson took a huge number of papers in his hands and looked at it carefully. Russell told him that he was leaving the solution to this problem to his discretion, after which he asked him to therefore make sure that this did not interfere with the economic prosperity of their lands. Calix began to speak. Russell asked him again. The main character approached Garrett Olson and, turning to him, said that all people from the financial sector were subject to investigation, with the exception of 4 employees. Calix continued to say that therefore he would have to appoint a new treasurer to the Ministry of Finance. Garrett Olson, with a confused expression on his face, uncertainly turned to him and asked him to be lenient to those who were the least guilty. After that, Garrett Olson began to loudly tell him that if none of the high-ranking officials were in their places, then there was a risk that they would have many problems. The main character looked him intently in the eyes with a cold look. At that time he was thinking that when it comes to money, you need to cooperate with those who can be completely trusted. Calix menacingly turned to Garrett Olson and asked him if he was afraid that they would suffer losses. Garrett Olson answered him negatively, after which Calix with a smile on his face asked him if they would appreciate his kindness in that case. After that, the main character suggested, or perhaps he decided to insult him in this way. Garrett Olson with a frightened expression on his face looking at Calix began to uncertainly deny it, explaining to him that they were just a little mistaken. The main character abruptly interrupted him and with a cold expression on his face, looking at him from under his brows, told him that he had already decided everything. Garrett Olson, who looked at him in fear with a confused expression on his face, thought that Calix was not at all like his former self. An image of little Calix appeared in his memories and he understood that this was no longer the kind child with an innocent soul. The aristocrats looked at each other in horror. They talked about the fact that if Russell is a symbol of martial arts, then Garrett Olson is a symbol of writing. They discussed the fact that even Garrett Olson cherishes in front of the first prince. They cursed in surprise asking what was going on. The main character, looking at the perplexed aristocrats, smiled widely, realizing that this was wonderful since almost the entire county belongs to him. He proudly looked in front of him with a grin on his face. Then he thought about what was happening now. He began to look at the system window in which information about Garrett Olson was written. Inside this system table was written his name, that is, Garrett Olson. He is 61 years old and his status is a baron. He belongs to the county of Shaken and his profession is the head of administrative affairs. Garrett Olson's predisposition is a strict advisor and his status is normal. Combat power of the first class and his level is 8 out of 33. Fame is 3 out of 7 and his reputation is 49. His administration is developed to S rank, finance to B rank, military affairs to E, diplomacy to D and development is also to D. After that, the main character began to study the system window with information about the personality of each of the nobles who were in this room. He paid attention to the system window with information about the personality of Greedo Dolman. He is 65 years old, and he is a baron belonging to the county of Shaken. By profession he is a diplomat, and by disposition an optimist. He has a normal status and an initial class. His fame is 4 and his reputation is 60. Then the protagonist turned his attention to another baron from the Shaken county who was the head of finance and a perfectionist of normal status. After that, the protagonist studied a huge number of system windows of various aristocrats in the room. With a wide smile on his face, Calix thought that it would become even more fun.